Good afternoon, everyone.
Hello.
Hello. My name is David Martin, and I'm the ambassador of France to South Africa, Lesotho, and Malawi. And it is my pleasure to greet today Judge Cameron. Is it the right protocol? It's fine.
Edwin is even better. Yeah.
And Ms. Surajpal. Perfect. Who are the guests today on the invitation of our colleagues from the IFAS French Institute in South Africa, Jean Spiry and Doreen Le Breton, to talk about several topics, but mostly prison in South Africa, under the angle of that book from Michel Foucault, called in French, Surveiller et punir, discipline and punish, translated in discipline and punish. So I'm not going to give a lecture on Michel Foucault and this particular book. You will do that way better. But just a few words to say that. So as a student, I guess some of us studied that book. It was published in 1975, and it starts by a creepy description of the public execution of a gentleman, a man, called Damien, who was the last person who tried to kill a king. Is probably, must be quick, I guess, but it's horribly graphic. You imagine 4 horses going in different directions attached to the body of the content, the convicted. So you can imagine how horrible that kind of execution was. That's the beginning. That's coming from Michel Foucault, was just to show that at that time, and coming also from Middle Age French history, executions were public, and they were designed. The current system is about panoptism. So not the panoptism by Jeremy Bentham, but the panoptism of as a constant system of surveillance based on observation. And indeed, if you consider French jails, for example, I'm not talking about others, but I visited many jails in France, and I must say that the biggest jail in Europe is in France, and it's designed exactly like that. So from wherever you are, prisoners are being observed, and they can be observed, and this is exactly how the prison is designed. So from that, Merleau-Ponty starts to conduct an analysis on the jail system and tries to bring philosophical consequences and lessons to them. And on this note, I think the best thing for me would be to leave you the floor, but just to again insist on the fact that you, Judge Cameron, have not only been a great legal professor, but you have been also, obviously, as everyone knows here, a promoter of rights of the new generation and a pioneer in the fight against every discrimination, to the point that you are now probably the best choice for South Africa to assume the role of Inspector General of South African jails, with the clear intention on your side to try and better the system, which is what everyone should do. And so on this, I think I should pause and leave the floor to Jean, who will moderate the conversation. And thank you very much again, both of you, for being with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you for this introduction. That's right, that's in Michel Foucault. That is a very creepy introduction. That is, I think, a kind of surprise for us is to discover that the idea of prison, like a sentence, is very recent. And to see that, of course, we have this image of Bastille in France as a prison, but it was a prison for aristocratic people. It was not a very common sentence. And some of the center was first for people that were described as mad before being an instrument. And that's very strange because prisons were born in 80, 20, things like that, a little bit before. And Tocqueville, the French philosopher, went to America. You know that, he made a very famous book, Democracy in America. And prisons were developed in the United States. It's the beginning of a long story between United States and prisons. And he came back and said, those prisons, they are a school for crime. And that is very strange. That the debate from the beginning of the emergency of jail was quite the same than now. Tocqueville said, yes, but prison is perhaps not a good solution. So just to remember that, because we have the impression that prisons exist for a lot of time. You have this image in France of Bastille, but it's a very recent invention. And my first question is that, how recent is prison in South Africa? And I think they played a very different role than prison in France. So if you can just tell a short history about the place of prisons in South Africa. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John, and thank you very much, Ambassador Martineau. We are delighted to be here, and thank you to Cecilia and her colleagues for all the arrangements. It is fascinating, and the point of Foucault, starting with that gruesome, grisly, horrific exposition, is that he says that the delinquent emerges at the end of the 18th century, early 19th century, with the invention of prison. And it's also, in South Africa, incarceration in that way starts. And before that, of course, as we trace in the early chapters of the book, there were horrific punishments in South Africa as well. I don't know if there was drawing and quartering, I doubt it, but there were appalling punishments. And there was incarceration on Robben Island, but the idea of, Foucault presents the idea of what we have, or what we take as assumed and normal in society, which is mass incarceration, large numbers of adult males cooped up in constrained circumstances with loss of liberty, and as he says, it's a bodily infliction. That certainly matches what we have today, and it also goes back to the first half of the 18th century, of the 19th century. At that point, the United Kingdom was sending its criminals, so defined, to Australia. They were, for a 50-year period spanning the turn of the century, they were sent to Australia, transported to Australia. And in America, the prisons, the outlaws or people went westwards. So there was a migratory aspect to delinquency, which eventually in America turned into mass incarceration. And Foucault treats the idea of mass incarceration as astonishing, and rightly so. And I'll ask Sohela to come in now, because Sohela and our other co-author, Rebecca Gore, we worked together, the three of us, at the Inspectorate for Prisons. They wrote most of the book. I get the credit for it because my surname starts with a C, and Sohela starts with an S. But the point, Jean, that you and Ambassador Martineau make is illustrated in South Africa in many very disturbing ways. The social profile, the class demography of prisoners under apartheid was black men who were poor, marginalized, often rural black men arrested for past offenses in this city, and Jutta Street in Braamfontein. and marginalized poor people, and it has remained so identically under democracy. The overwhelming number of prisons, about 2 or 3% are women. Erin here is going to tell us a bit about her thesis, which is interested in women. I enjoy putting you on the spot, Erin. She's doing a thesis at WITS in the history department. Very small numbers of women, and there may be complex reasons behind that, but overwhelmingly. And the second part of what you raise and what the ambassador raises is the schools for crime. Now, Foucault has been accused of crude determinism and of over-functionalizing the class divisions. But it is true. You go into prison, you meet the gangs immediately. We've seen it. We visited Mossel Bay Youth Center just 4 or 5 weeks ago. Sohela and I and a colleague, Tembelihle Ngema, and we saw children in the children's section. The youngest was 15. He'd been tattooed all over. On his right temple, there was a tattoo which said "bad boy." And they had committed offenses of some sort, but they were schooling in crime inside. We went to the cell next door, which was one of the most rank and olfactorily offensive places I visited. A rank smell of urine and feces and bodily exusions. And how many people? 80 to 100 people in a cell for 20 to 25. These were the juveniles under 21. So I want to criticize Foucault, and I will do when we speak later about this splendid exhibition that you have put together, or your colleagues. Thank you for doing so. I'll speak about Foucault and AIDS because it's a very poignant story. But I'll speak later on about the accusation that he's deterministic in what he says, but that prisons function as schools for crime is undoubtedly true.
Thanks. The other point I want to make is about the development of the prison system, and Foucault is obviously very cynical about how prisons work and what they do in society, but the introduction he makes, that gruesome description, does make the point that prisons are a reform and that in certain ways are a humane reform. And in the book, we discuss the fact that, at least in the United States, the sort of godfather of mass incarceration, religious groups like the Quakers really did have a humane mission in mind when they started prisons. In South Africa, that's not quite true, because formal imprisonment or mass incarceration begins in South Africa not as a humane reform of the existing criminal justice system, but as a colonial imposition. And it continues to function that way during apartheid, to control labor, to ensure a supply of free or at least cheap labor, black labor, to control movement and to prevent dissent or resistance. And so that's one distinction, but what Foucault is right about is that the history of prison is a history of reform. And in South Africa, the point that we make in the book is that we really did try reform. When we transitioned to a democracy, many of our leaders, our new political elites, had themselves been imprisoned. They knew what it meant. And so we really did commit to doing something different and to creating not a prison system, but a correctional system. And we enshrined certain rights in our constitution to dignified conditions of detention. We enacted a Correctional Services Act that sets certain minimum standards for treatment. We tried to approach crime more holistically, but that reform, we argue, has not been successful. It's had certain successes, but it overall has not been successful, in large part because we as a society fell prey to a lie or to a mistaken idea. We fell prey to this idea that post-apartheid there was this horrific crime wave, a wave of violent crime. But when we look at the figures, we see that that doesn't seem to have been the case, that crime and violent crime, especially murder, was high at the time of transition, especially political violence, but that it then decreased, and it continued to decrease until 2011, and we can talk about why the trend reversed. But the point is that there doesn't seem to have been this genuine crime wave, but we all believed there was. And so our new government, desperate to be seen to be doing something, adopted these tough on crime, tough on criminal approaches. We imported the war on drugs, we imported the war on crime from the US. We imported things like super maximum security prisons from the US. And so even now, and at the inspectorate that we work on, we are engaged in a process of continuous reform, or at least attempted continuous reform. But as Justice Cameron says, we still see really troubling continuities in our prison system today.
Thank you. Foucault says that prison is a mirror of a society, and for us, it's very surprising to say that the sociology and demography of prisons have no change between the apartheid period and the democracy period, because of course the reasons to be in jail are changing. So it's, I think, a big question about the margin, about the poverty, about all the reasons that send to jail people, and not only to crime but to jail. That is two different things to my mind. I have a question that Frédéric Noir, who is a specialist of Foucault, a professor in Sciences Po Paris, said that commonly we have four goals of a jail sentence, to reaffirm the law, to make a visualization of the law, to protect society, and protect society, the question is during the sentence. After, we have this question of school of crime, but to protect during the sentence, to change someone for the better. And I think the face on this is going done into politicians' views, fortunately. And the last one is that we call restorative justice, and the place of victim, what is a sentence of jail for victims. That was not quasi absent in Foucault, punish, surveiller, punir. Sorry, in my reminder, I think it's quasi absent, this question of restorative justice. And for you, do you think in all those items, jail is a failure, or is it for someone a good thing?
It's a complicated question, and in the book we grapple with it, and we, as co-authors, have different views about some issues, about whether we should abolish prisons or reform them or radically reform them. But we say that we acknowledge there are people in our prison system who have done genuinely terrible things and who have really harmed others. In the US, when abolitionists speak about abolition, they often speak about the many black men incarcerated for very long periods for nonviolent drug offenses. And of course we have people in our prisons for nonviolent offenses in our country, but we do have many people in our prisons who've done real harm. And so we acknowledge that there are many reasons to keep people in prison, at least for certain periods of time, or at least some people, to punish, to deter, to attempt to reform. But we say we are putting too many people in prison, and we specifically are putting them in prison for too long. And so one of the things we really take aim at in our book are what we call mandatory minimum sentences. So part of the wrong turn our country took on crime was to take away discretion from a sentencing judge to impose the sentence they see fit, and to say, well, these are the minimum sentences, barring exceptional circumstances that a certain crime attracts. And that makes sense for consistency and fairness reasons. But we didn't just create a consistent standard, we created a stricter standard. And so we especially expanded the list of crimes that attract life sentences in South Africa. And the figure we often use is that in 1995 there were 483 people sentenced to life in South Africa's prisons. Now there are about 19,000 people sentenced to life in our prisons. So our adoption of these mandatory minimum sentences combined with stricter approaches to parole means that people spend longer and longer periods in prison. And they spend longer periods in overcrowded prisons where they're exposed to violence, where they're exposed to gangs, where they are exposed to just living in undignified, inhumane conditions that we don't think contribute meaningfully to reform. And so in those conditions and in that way, if someone is spending a minimum of 25 years in prison, we think the reform purpose, the deterrent purpose, all start to lose. Those sentences are less justifiable on those grounds. And so it's not just that prison can't be justified in terms of those purposes, but the way we approach incarceration in our country with very, very long sentences can't be justified.
I want to answer Jean's question with two stories. The one is, in 1999, I spent 6 years on the High Court, and then I went to the Appeal Court in Bloemfontein for 8 years, and then my last 11 years were on the Constitutional Court. And all three courts I dealt with crimes, criminals, convictions, and sentencing. My last few months in the High Court, I sentenced a young man who's now known as Glenn Meyer, who'd committed horrific crimes. It was a drug-fueled crime. It was, the motivation was also drugs. And I sentenced him to a considerable period of prison. And after I was appointed inspecting judge, he contacted me. And he appears in the book as Glenn Meyer. And you'll see the letter he wrote to me. You can look him up in the index. And very, very moving. And he spoke at our 2 launches here in Exclusive Books down the road, Young Smuts at Oxford at Rosebank, and in Cape Town at the Book Lounge. Very movingly. And a young man called Awande Ntongana also spoke at the Cape Town launch, who'd been in Brandtvlei. And then we went to Krugersdorp prison recently. I want to tell the story of Glenn because, to get back to your question, we went to Krugersdorp recently, and we met also a young man, a qualified accountant, who had been deeply involved in the Marcus Jooste saga, which is the biggest fraud in South African history. Marcus Jooste committed self-ending, is alleged to have committed self-ending. And this young man pleaded guilty and turned state evidence. So he was sentenced to 10 years imprisonment with half suspended. And he was on a program called Heart Work, which is run by a German woman called E. It's not Elise, it's not Elsie. Anyway, I'll tell you what her name is, it'll occur to me now, and her husband. And we then went 2 weeks later to the graduation of the Heartworks program in Zonderwater. And there were 21, mostly young men, some of them in their 30s and 40s, who'd done the Heartworks program for the whole year, which is a program of introspection, reflection, accountability, self-accountability, reflection on what had happened without reproach and acceptance of responsibility. Completely remarkable. Each of them was called up to receive a certificate, and each of them gave a testimonial. And so, long answer, Jean, but I've got to your question. Glenn Meyer attributes his insight and the beneficial effect. He was very lucky. He was 19 when he committed the terrible deeds that he did, and 20 when I sentenced him. And he went to a youth prison like the one in Mossel Bay, where we saw these 16 kids in these terrible conditions. And Ben spoke to us, and he doesn't mind me using his name because he's open about it. He's appeared in the newspapers. And he says the HeartWorks program has changed. So it's possible, Jean, but we have got 166,000 prisoners in a room for 105,000. The overcrowding is not excessive, it is horrific. It is hard to articulate to you the circumstances that we have seen. I've seen Sohela, who's been working very closely with me for the last 3.5 years. So the mass incarceration is horrific. It's wrong. It's the wrong approach to societal dysfunction. It's the wrong approach in a society like South Africa. And when people get up, and I will understand if you do, and I'll be respectful if you do, people get up and say, my child was killed on the Cape Flats, or my mother was raped, my father was shot. And I do think that some harsh consequences have to follow. There has to be accountability. It does not consist in overcrowded prisons. It does not consist in over-harsh sentencing. It does not consist in requiring persons who face life sentences, who used to be able to apply for parole after 11 years and 8 months, now have to wait 25 years. Does not consist in any of that. So a well-run prison system could achieve a lot. And Ben Palas, Glenn Meyer, and Awande, they all illustrate what can be done, but it's not being done.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we have the same problem in France. Prisons are also overcrowded.
Don't you want to tell the story of your former president Sarkozy?
He was not overcrowded in the prison, but yeah, he will wrote a book. We helped to translate the Albi Sachs prison diary this year. We can translate other prison diary from French to South Africa if you want. No, to be more serious, it's a problem of France too, to be overcrowded, but sometimes we have the impression that this overcrowding is English is sometimes make impossible the idea to have in prison some activities to rehab, to have to being better. For example, we spoke one time about the books in prison and the sort of reading activities that we have in France, but it's very few because when it's overcrowded, you have other things to do. And sometimes for people at the exterior, those activities are things like, lazier, and people are understanding less and less this question of doing better, make a work about himself. And the other part is the overcrowding. Let the impression that when we use alternative to prison, it's not because alternative of prison have sense, but just to fight against the overcrowding. We say prisons are full, so let's invent something else. And it's a pity because, of course, to invent alternative to prison, it's a very important goal. But sometimes when prisons are overcrowding, there is these two problems. First one, not to be able to have activities, to rehab the people, and the second is to have bad alternative to prison, not very well thought, of course. So what is your view on that?
Most of my views are informed by conversations with Sohela. It's true.
It's an interesting question because it's something that's come up. We've been trying to push at JIX for the reform of the parole system, and especially parole for people sentenced to life. And our Minister Groenewold's position is that his primary objective is to protect the public in general. And so he doesn't think we should be releasing people purely because prisons are overcrowded, as you say. And it's a fair perspective, but I think when you see, as Justice Cameron has just described, the reality of an overcrowded prison, it's hard to really believe that we shouldn't be doing everything possible to decongest. Yeah, I think when we think about prisons, if we haven't seen the inside of a South African prison, you think of what you see on TV. You think of sort of an American TV cell where two people share a bunk bed, and that's the cell, and that's terrible, sure. In South Africa, most of the prison cells we see are these communal cells. I would say that they're about the size from this shelf to that wall, and maybe from here to the counter. They're designed for maybe 20 people, maximum 30 people. We regularly, especially in urban prisons, find that those cells designed for maximum 30 have 60, 70, even 80 people. When we visited Krugersdorp, there were 2 awaiting trial cells which had 90 people squeezed into those space. And we need to understand that they spend all day in those conditions. They don't leave and spend their day in the exercise courtyard. Our constitution and our statute guarantees 1 hour of exercise outside of your cell every day. So at most, generally, that is what they'll get. If they are in a very undercrowded prison, maybe 3 hours of exercise a day. But we often hear from people who don't get exercise every day because the prisons are so understaffed and incapable of dealing with the overcrowding that they feel they cannot safely release those prisoners for exercise every day. So that's 23 or 24 hours a day in these cramped conditions with basically nothing to do. Books are a luxury, even though we try through donation campaigns to make them available. A TV is a rarity. You might find them sometimes, but you almost never do. Maybe people have a pack of cards. They have very little access to rehabilitation programs. And if you're an awaiting trial prisoner, which about a third of our prison population, about 60,000 people in our prisons, haven't been convicted or sentenced to prison time, but are awaiting trial, you have no access to programs because you haven't been found guilty of anything, so why should you need to be rehabilitated? And all of those 90 men will share a single toilet, maybe 2 showers. If no water runs, the smell permeates the entire room. And so I do think overcrowding is at the level in our country where it is an end. Addressing overcrowding it's a justifiable end on its own. But you're right also that there are other reasons to think about alternatives to prison. And the research that we looked at when we were writing the book said that restorative justice programs which focus on what a victim or a survivor or a person or community affected by crime needs to make right the harm against them can sometimes be much more effective than punitive prison sentences. Because in the criminal justice system as we have it, a victim or a survivor is not a party to a case. They don't have a say really in how a matter proceeds and how a person is punished or held accountable or makes amends. That is the state or the judiciary's decision. And so there are things like community service, there are things like even paying damages or reparations of some kind that can really make good to people the harm that they suffered. And as much as I said earlier that there are many people in our prisons who've done really terrible things, we also meet people in our prisons who are there mostly because they are poor or they are under-resourced and underprivileged. When we went to Durban Correctional Center last year, we were in the awaiting trial section, and the officials showed us several inmates who had been caught for possessing very small amounts of drugs, clearly for personal consumption. And many of them had been granted bail of 200 Rand, of 300 Rand, but they couldn't even afford that. And so they stayed in prison for months purely because they couldn't afford that. So addressing overcrowding doesn't just have to mean alternatives to people who have been found guilty of crimes. It can also mean figuring out how to make our criminal justice system more effective, deciding who really belongs in prison and who should be addressed in other ways.
Thank you. And you were talking about alternative to jail. Which alternatives do you develop in South Africa? Or it's just the beginning, or there is a big movement to develop alternatives? In France, we begin, I think, we have since a long time alternative, but we begin to have a large movement of reflection about alternatives 10 years ago. And what is the situation in South Africa?
I'm going to ask Sohela to answer part of that, but I want to start off with an observation, John. The debate about alternatives in South Africa is conducted on false premises. If there was a rigorous implementation of of crime, of prosecution, of detection, of arraignment, of sentencing, you would be able to say, well, what are the alternatives? But this is something that Sohela figured out for us when you were writing the book. You tell us about the 11%.
So we looked at the number of murders that SAPS reports every year, because murder is one of those crimes where we can rely generally on our official stats. It doesn't depend on how much people trust the police and report crimes. It just relies on us finding bodies and figuring out that they have been murdered or died unnaturally, and we can pretty reliably do that. So in our country, there are about 27,000 murders every year. Then we looked at, for the same period, how many successful prosecutions for murder the National Prosecuting Authority reported. And obviously there's a time difference, but if you look at the stats over a certain period of time, you can figure out what the general successful conviction and sentencing rate is for murder. And over that same period, the prosecuting authority reported about just under 3,000 prosecutions for murder. And so we figured out that means in general, we have an about 11% successful conviction rate for murder, which means about 89% of murderers get away scot-free. And the point there is that the debate shouldn't really be about how we punish the people we effectively convict of murder, but how do we make sure we catch all of the people who are murdering other people?
What happened after democracy is that we put our faith in carcerality, long sentences, harsh conditions, supermax prisons, and it was a catastrophically long term. So there are alternatives, but we would need to start. We don't deny that some people should be in prison. We don't deny that there has to be consequences for everyone who harms someone else. And we don't deny that sometimes those consequences have to be severe. Some people have to be locked up for very long periods, perhaps for the rest of their lives. But what we are doing now is arbitrary. It's completely arbitrary to jail for life. 11%, and rapists. There are 50,000 rapes reported every year, and we didn't even do that. It would have been worse.
We did, I think, and it was even less.
What was the proportion?
I can't remember, but I would say closer to 5%.
5% of rapists. So we are taking a smaller and smaller number of offenders and sentencing them to incarceration for longer and longer. And that's an elite phenomenon. That's us. It's the ambassador and Jean and Sohela and me and Aaron, the Wits group. It's an elite method of thinking that we're doing something effective and we're not. And that's my answer to your question about alternatives. Anything about what we do? No.
No, I don't want your mic is on your blazer.
I'll replace it. Thank you.
I don't know if I think you know the proportion in the budget between prevention and punishment in the justice budget. And what is that? Because it's always a great question. How do you prevent crime? And because you treat, okay, you punish sometimes, but how do you prevent?
This is the corny left of center answer. And it's the answer I'm giving, because it's what I believe. You create a just society with less inequality.
Agree completely. And just to add, I would say, our debate looks a little bit different in South Africa than in, for example, the US, and I imagine even in France, where you can clearly see the injustice in the prison system because it's based entirely almost on race, maybe migrants who are of different race or to speak a different language. In South Africa, our prison population is overwhelmingly black and colored, but people don't necessarily see that as an injustice because it tends to mirror our country's demographics. But when we go into prisons, what we see is that people in prisons are also overwhelmingly poor and under-resourced. And I think that's the root of the injustice in our country. And it's also the problem with prisons and whether or not they prevent crime and keep our society safe, which is that we have a sort of distribution problem. On the one hand, we send too many people to prison for too long. On the other hand, we don't send many of the people doing the most harm in our country to prison, whether they be 89% of murderers or whether they be the people who are capturing our state and stealing billions and billions from our country's most needful people. Or the drug lords or the gang leaders. Those people are not in our prisons because they can afford to work the system.
I'm drawing up a list of my favorite people who are not in prison.
I think there is a question in the bridge.
Merci. So thank you very much for everything. I have two questions. I had a conversation with Minister Froneman about his project of a bond fund. I'd like to have your insight on it. How would it work? What do you think of it? And the second would be, so in France there's a form of reparative justice that is being more and more used and has showed some efficiency. I'd like to know what you think of it and if it does exist in South Africa. Thank you.
Do you want to speak about the bail fund?
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, the bail fund is not the minister's project. It's our project.
So please know that he's into it.
Yes,
good.
we hear that. No, we started I think at JIX just before I joined, and it's continued since. We started thinking about how to address the number of people in our prisons who have been granted bail, which means a court has decided they can be released safely, they won't intimidate witnesses or harm others or abscond, but can't afford that bail. And in particular, at the Prisons Inspectorate, we track the number of people who've been granted bail of 1,000 rand or less. And obviously that number is constantly changing and refreshing because entering it. But it's consistently between 2,000 to 3,000 people, which is not a huge chunk of 60,000 people awaiting trial, but it's a significant number of people who are detained, we think, unjustly. We call them prisoners of poverty. And so we started to explore bail funds, which exist in other countries, in the US most commonly, but also in the Philippines, in Malawi, where members of the community or non-profit organizations put up bail for people who've been granted bail. Sometimes they have restrictive conditions about who qualifies for that bail. Sometimes they don't. And often what they'll also do is try to ensure that those people have the support they need to actually show up for their trials. Because they find that the reason people abscond is not because they don't want to show up for their trial, but because they can't afford transport, because they aren't literate and can't keep track of constantly changing court dates, because they don't have childcare. And so they try to find ways to also provide that support. And they have stunning success rates, generally above 90% of people who they grant bail who do in fact show up for their trials, many of whom are eventually acquitted. And so we have been exploring the idea of launching a bail fund in South Africa. We conducted a feasibility study. We have just launched a pilot project because we've secured private funding, not from the state, but from donors. And we are planning to roll it out in the Western Cape specifically, targeting Pollsmoor, where there are about 600 people awaiting trial, less than 1,000 rand bail.
Jean, I want to make a point about the inspectorate that we both work with and about Foucault.
Perfect.
We must show the audience how learned we are. So JIX was Mandela's project. He came out of prison 11th of February 1990. He'd been inside prisons in various conditions, starting breaking up rocks and getting dust in his lungs for 4 or 5 years in Robben Island. At the end of his prison, in a suite, more or less a suite in Pollsmoor, and then in a house in Poll, on prison grounds, a warder's house. And he said, and Sohela related this earlier, he said, we're going to change our prison system. We're going to give conditions of consistent with human dignity in the Bill of Rights, in the Prisons Act, which was enacted during his presidency. And so we get this Bill of Rights, and then we get a statute in the second last year of Mandela's presidency, 1998, the Correctional Services Act, which reflects all these noble aspirations. And one of them was an inspectorate, an independent inspectorate, which is headed at his insistence by a judge. Other inspectorates don't have judges, and I think there's a lot to be said for it. You take a retired prisons officer, or you take a formerly incarcerated person, an ex-inmate, put them in the head because they know what to go and look at. But Mandela wanted the independence and the position of the judge. And we, like with much else in Foucault, I want to get back to where he falls short, Jean, but we illustrate what Foucault says. He references Bentham's panopticon, which he regards as the emblem of what his theory is, that you put people not just incarcerated, but you put them under the gaze of the warders. You put their bodies under the gaze. And when we go and inspect prisons, we look at the beds, we check the linen, we look in the urinals, we flush the toilets, we open the taps. We are enacting what Foucault describes as the intrusive invasion. We do it for what we believe are functionally beneficial reasons, and I think we are right. I'm not agonizing when I say this. What I'm talking about is the enactment of Foucault's insights about the prison. And that leads to a larger question. And it's a question also that we experienced as South Africans in the 1980s. I was a lawyer attached to Wits, defending liberation soldiers, as I call, who were removed from the land, protesters, people who threw stones, and also conscientious objectors, white men who refused to go into. And we were given the question, aren't you just helping apartheid? And it's not a bad question, it's a good question. Did the fact Arthur Chaskelson, Sidney Kentridge, Godfrey Pitchie, George Bezos, that there was a noble tradition of resistance lawyers who were working within the system, did that perpetuate the system? And the same question about our inspectorate. Are we doing what Foucault says? He said, Ambassador Martin, such a dumb statement. He said, it doesn't matter if you're going to give a prisoner chocolate at Christmas. What you've got to do is to reform the outside world. Yes, of course we've got to reform the outside world, Jean, but you've also got to give them chocolate. Yes.
Nothing to add.
Sohela's got something to add. She always has. Am I bullying you?
You're bullying
Okay.
me.
I have
Sorry.
No.
that's the last question before.
Today.
Apartheid was a police state, and prison has a major role in this state. You have this experience of democracy, of course, return of democracy. You have the Commission Truth and Reconciliation that is sometimes an example of reparative justice. And the question is why so few things change? Because you have sort of you invent something very new in South Africa. So why we can't see that in the vision of prison? Even if Mandela has this intuition to have an independent inspector.
I want to give you a long answer, and it comes from Karl Marx. He says if you change the personnel without changing the structure, you replicate the structure. That's what we've done. We've got a greedy, self-enriching elite. I'm not allowed to speak politics, otherwise I'll get the Chief Justice during part of my time was reprimanded for telling the government it had to support Israel. Well, look how well that turned out. Ambassador Martin, I won't embarrass you by asking your stand on the genocide, the horrific genocide perpetrated by Israel, not just in Gaza, but on the West Bank. But I think that's the answer. The ANC, the governing party, the governing elite, which wasn't only the ANC after the transition, didn't address root causes. It changed the personnel, and the personnel fell into the old habits of self-enrichment like white people did. That's a crude answer, and I apologize for its crudity, but it's roughly what I believe.
Yeah, I agree completely. And I often think that like a reason to care about prisons is because inside a prison you see magnified all of the issues that we have outside prison in our country. All of the problems with race and with poverty and with unemployment and with gangs. So absolutely.
And sexual assault.
And sexual assault and masculinized violence. And so, there's absolutely, the failure to transform prisons comes from a failure to transform society in general. But I also think that it's easy to not care about transforming prisons. Most people will never see the inside of a prison. Many of us, especially if you are in the middle class or if you're an elite, won't know people or care about prison or have to visit them or struggle to reach them on the telephone because prisons just don't have enough telephones. And so, and the media generally doesn't have access to prisons except in very rare instances. But it's also uncomfortable to think about prisons. It's not nice, even when you work in the field, to go to bed and to think about 90 men sleeping in a space built for 20. So I think it's natural for us, especially when many of us legitimately are worried about crime, are scared of crime, have been affected by crime. It's fair for us to have thought prisons are not our priority and prisoners are not our priority. And we have so many other problems in our country to worry about. But going back to the first point, if we care about those other problems in our country, we have to care about prisons as well.
Thank you. I have a lot of questions, but I know the public has questions too. So who wants to? Yeah, I think it's. yeah.
I think this is it.
If you want to sit 1 minute.
Thank you very much for the privilege and for the occasion. We really appreciate our work as a lawyer in the space of penal law. I've represented various prisoners in their parole review applications, and I've also lately started representing victims of crime in parole review applications. I feel blessed that I've had the opportunity, but it has certainly brought a number of things to my attention, which I'm going to express today, and in the hope that maybe it falls onto fertile grounds. I was wondering while I listened to your observations whether there's any statistics being kept about the number of prisoners who are in jail for serious crimes, for instance, murder, rape. To what extent do you keep records on whether prisoners have been categorized as a serial rapist or a serial murderer? I think one cannot really treat various prisoners the same. They are not equal, their circumstances, their pathology, so we will have to keep that in mind. The other thing that that I thought I should just mention, I became aware last year that there was indeed remand prisoners at Paulsmoor prison that had the privilege of attending some of the programs while being in remand already. So I thought I would just mention that.
Very unusual.
Yes. But then I think the thing that I would like to say is maybe the prisoners are telling us what we should be doing. When we look at the behavior that exists at this point in time, I think we started off by acknowledging the fact that prisoners learn in prison. So maybe we should ask ourselves, what are we teaching? Shouldn't we just change the curriculum? And how about having a prison university where we take the students that are bona fide students out of an environment where people have no choice but to learn survival. And learning survival in our current prison system means learning by means of surviving by crime. So if there haven't been that violent person outside to start off with, as a youngster entering the system, they might be when they leave. I'm also aware of a prisoner in a facility in Limpopo that I'm giving a lot of thought about at the moment, who was sentenced to life imprisonment at the age of 21, when he was part of a group of people who was convicted of murder by means of something we know as common purpose in our legal system. That person was still at school when that happened. He was a matriculant at the time. He never had an opportunity to finish his schooling. However, in prison he's trying his best. But when he was sentenced, he didn't have the privilege of a sentencing report, which is something that is inevitably available to people with means. Before they're being sentenced, they get a pre-sentencing report, and the social worker can give input into their ability to be rehabilitated, their backgrounds, what might have given rise to the circumstances, etc. And at this point in time, I feel very strongly that that should be something that should be compulsory. That when you sentence a youth, a young person, for such a long time, or you think he's committed a crime that would warrant a sentence like that, that something like a pre-sentencing report should be compulsory and the state should pay for it. Likewise, when it comes to victims, I have a few thoughts. When it comes to victims, they are part of the criminal justice system when they give evidence about what happened, and thereafter they are left. They may become aware, often by accident, that they may attend parole hearings, and they can provide input into what's happened, how the crime has affected them, etc., etc. But how will that assist society if we leave in society people that are broken? Shouldn't we be fixing the people that are victims as well? If we send the criminal to prison and we hope he gets rehabilitated, and maybe they are, and we know there are programs that they attend, what about the victims? As a society, shouldn't we be fixing our people so that when people come from prison, we as a society can work together to assist them in becoming a meaningful participant again? So, my questions to you today is, to what extent do you think, when we speak about alternatives, I know people always say money. At the recent parole summit in Pretoria, we had the privilege of listening to a whole lot of good ideas to reduce the prison population. But inevitably, a lot of them were being halted by a lack of funds. Now, if we say we're wanting to teach people and we want to maybe have a prison university in every province, then what would it take to get that money? And what is the cost of not doing it? So I would leave that with you, and I hope you would give it some thought. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna.
I think those are all excellent observations and clearly come from a place of real experience, and I don't have much to add to them except to say that when we approached the department to figure out how much it was spending on people who couldn't afford bail amounts of 200 or 300 rand, they calculated that in the average month they spend about just over 12,000 rand on every prisoner. I mean, I think if you gave a person in our country 12,000 rand a month, I would imagine they would be able to do a lot to turn their life around and possibly to avoid the circumstances that often lead to crime. But yeah, the point is that we clearly have money in our country, and at the moment we are directing a lot of it into this punitive criminal justice response to our social problems, but there are many other responses that we could adopt instead, and where we think we should direct those funds.
And I would add, thank you very much. I think that you've got more recent hands-on experience of we are dealing with the symptoms, but you're dealing with the turbulent causes and the origins. So thank you very much for what you've just said. I would also say that the way you put it is it makes it feel overwhelming. And what we do in the book, which you've kindly brought along with you, which I thank you for, is we say there are things you can do immediately. And that's with our whole issue. We say that's why it's a hopeful book. It's not a book of grimness and despair at all. We say that there are things that we can do immediately. There are things that we can do in the medium term. There are things that we've got to do in the longer term. The first thing we've got to do is to abolish minimum sentences, not just because they inflict great injustice, which they do, but not always, but because they are so dreadfully miscast. It's a dreadful wrong turn that our democracy took under the Mandela presidency. And the other things that we can also do, controversial things, which we say that the war on drugs is fueling the carnage on the Cape Flats, the level of murders and children. And in Westbury is just 9 or 10 kilometers from where we are. The criminalization of drugs, like the criminalization of alcohol possession, consumption, distribution, and sale in America under prohibition, fueled the mafia, fueled murders, prohibition was a beneficial intervention in the minds of those who insisted on it, like the war on drugs. But they are both terribly, terribly mistaken. There are other things, to go back to Sohela's point, there are other things that you can do. Treating smoking, treating alcohol consumption, we don't criminalize the people who do all those harmful things. Treating drug use, drug distribution, and drug sale, drug transactions as a public health problem. I agree that some drugs, there has to be a prohibition on the distribution of some drugs. Fentanyl, is a good example. But we are instigating the criminal cartels, and very many of the criminal cartels that have been somewhat smugly referred to by there's the holy witnesses and the unholy witnesses in front of Parliament. And I don't think that any of them are holy. But some of the holy witnesses have referred with great smugness to criminal cartels. The drug trade underlies so many of the criminal cartels in our country. So I think that we should abolish the criminalization of many of the drugs, and it'll have a beneficial effect. Use the money on treating it as a public issue. Jean, thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you for your testimony and questions, and thank you. I think the question of war against drugs, it's a big question in France now. It has always been a question because France is the first country in Europe for drug consumption, even if the legislation is very hard. So it's of course a question, and we have a lot of questions now from traffics and mafia. That is people that call themselves mafia of drugs. So it's not the debate of the day, but it could be an interesting debate for the future. And I have my own advice, but I can't say because we are neutral and public servant. Yeah. I think you had a question too. It's okay.
Hi, thank you very much for your presentations, conversations. It's so interesting. As you both know, because I harassed you prior to
You didn't.
the beginning of the presentation.
Thank you.
I'm doing my PhD in history at FITS, looking at changing policies in reform and rehabilitation for women prisoners. And something that I made note of while you were speaking is very interesting to me because in 1976 they published this full UN Commission.
Yes.
Which was kind of tasked with understanding the prison system in
Yes.
Africa, but with the exception they weren't allowed to analyze the efficacy of the death penalty. That was the one topic they weren't allowed to kind of look at, because as we know, the Nats were very pro-death penalty right until the end.
And it was 5 years into the clampdown against the ANC.
Yes.
And they were executing political offenders.
Yeah.
Sorry.
And so what's interesting is that a large part of what this commission kind of investigated were things like mandatory minimum sentencing and the lack of discretion that judges had to make a case that was based on circumstance. And one of the examples actually is very much tied to the 1971 drug law, which criminalized the sale of things like marijuana, but also the personal use of things like marijuana or dacha. And it's the same issues that we're discussing today were very relevant in kind of public discourse in the early 1970s. And so it's just very interesting sitting here kind of listening to you talk about these issues where it's the same thing. Someone found with a very small amount of drugs on their person gets a mandatory sentence of a very long time when they weren't actually intending on selling or distributing. And judges had no option but to impose a mandatory sentence. And so it's just very, very interesting. And I was wondering if you could reflect on, I guess, the kind of nature of, I hate saying this, but history repeating itself. And I think that's just one aspect of what was discussed today that I can really kind of draw a clean parallel to, but there are about 20 more. But obviously not going to keep everybody. But yeah, once again, thank you very much. And I realized that this wasn't really a question, but a monologue.
No. It's a helpful contribution. Self-effacement. Women
Do you want to?
No, I don't. Thank you. I can supplement, but no, I'd like you to, if you don't mind.
I think you know a lot more about prisons in the 1700s than I do, but I think that, I guess one of the interesting things about this book is obviously that as co-authors, we come from different generations, and I am born free, and I studied law and human rights law, and so have always been very optimistic about our country and our democracy and our constitution, and working in prisons has been in some ways disheartening because I've seen the failures of our transition and of our democracy in a way that's often quite hard to grapple with, and absolutely this repetition of historical injustice. But I think I've also seen ways that institutions like the Prisons Inspectorate, democratic inventions, even the way prisoners talk to us or complain to us, they use the language of the Constitution, they claim their rights, they feel that they have an entitlement to dignity, and they don't always get it, but it's clear that there's this ownership of our democracy and over our constitution, and that is reason to have hope, I think, as well.
I think so, Yeah, I do think that minimum sentences in South Africa are fascinating because they were started with a defiance campaign, but they were still allowed to be suspended. So Rumpf, who later became a very reactionary Chief Justice in Bloemfontein, sentenced a young firebrand lawyer called Mandela to a suspended sentence in the early 1950s. So then during the post-Sharpeville massacre emergency, they reintroduced minimum sentences, and Connie Mulder, the father of the present leader of the Freedom Front and the colleague of Minister Groenewald, he introduced, echoing Richard Nixon, reintroduced minimum sentences. If you had a matchbox full of dagga, 112 grams of dagga, you were presumed to be a dealer with a minimum sentence of 5 years. Horrific. So, and then we, in our democracy, we embrace this terrible history. I don't know the answer to your question, Erin, but it's a pertinent question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Doreen.
Thank you. I have two questions. First one, you talked about this historical figure of 11%. Of course, you mentioned the problem of corruption, and I can also mention the lack of education or poor education for policemen and also staff in the prison. So how is it, and how is it to compare to about that time in terms of police force? And the second question is more practical: is the electronic bracelet existing here?
Oh. Doreen, you make me want to cry when you mention the electronic bracelet, because it is actually a hugely effective. Bolsonaro, the charming former president of Brazil, tried to remove his, and they discovered it, and they arrested him because he was planning to leave, or allegedly. It's a very effective, supplant, what is it, alternative to prison. So I want to cry, because it was. And it got mired in corruption by Bosasa. We found an item on the CSIR's, Council for Scientific and Industrial Research website, where they were researching the bracelets, and we wrote to the person, never got an answer. We wrote to the president of the CSIR, didn't get an answer. So it exists and can be done cheaply, relatively cheaply to the expenditure. So, but your first question was about the educational level, and I want to make one quick point, Doreen, if I may, that police brutality and brutality in our prisons has actually gone up under our democracy. If you look at the number of people that apartheid policemen killed, not talking about the massacres, the 1976 and 1960, the incidental communal garden police brutality and killings has actually gone up, which is a sobering thought.
Is there any more question? I have one. Oh.
No, respectfully, you didn't answer my question on reparative justice. I do think it has a future in South Africa.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Stop?
I think it does, and we're not applying it, but it's very important, and it takes commitment and thought and structures, but you can start. There's no problem in our country that isn't capable of remediation with the right thought and the right start. You've got to start, and we don't have it, but we should have it.
One place we have a more restorative, reparative-based model is in child justice. Not all children, as we've spoken about the children we've seen in history, but in general, child offenders, there's an attempt to divert them away from prison to embrace. The Child Justice Act actually calls for restorative processes, for bringing together communities, parents, affected people, victims, and interestingly, the Constitutional Court ruled that you couldn't apply mandatory minimum sentences to children specifically. So with children, we've taken a different approach, and we do have comparatively a very low number of children in our prisons. So that's just to say that it can be done. We're doing it with children, and I see no reason why we couldn't apply a similar logic to at least some of our adult offenders.
Agreed.
Thank you. I have a question linked with your exhibition. You know, one of the countries in the world where the HIV epidemic is growing and growing is Russia, and especially in jails, in prisons, because of question of drugs use and with the same needles, with a lot of question. And what is the health situation in South Africa? It's a big question.
We were in touch with Sean Shelley, who's a formerly incarcerated person, formerly homeless person in South Africa, who is now the head in London of, what is it called, Anada? I'm not sure. It's the international organization that opposes the criminalization of drugs.
Not UN.
But there is a center that used to function in Pretoria that gave people needle exchanges, that gave them a substitution for heroin, which is an addictive drug. I don't know if there are substitutes for fentanyl, which is a almost immediately destructive and possibly fatal drug. So I'm not equating heroin with, but there have been green shoots to start that kind of intervention, but it hasn't gone far enough. No. There are good health programs in prison. Some of them were funded by USAID and by PEPFAR. For example, Stop TB, Stop HIV did the astonishing thing of making Truvada, one of the combination, it's a duotherapy, two of the drugs that I take every day for my HIV, they were distributing. If you don't have HIV and you take Truvada every day or even shortly before a risk-exposing sexual act, you have a 95% chance of not acquiring HIV. So that was being done. I don't know. I haven't spoken to Dr. Harry Hausler and Dr. Joel Steingo, who were the two people in charge of it, but I fear that on the night of the 25th of January, a message came from Musk and from the executive of the United States within days of Trump's election that said, your funding is cut. So I don't know what happened, but I fear. No, I just fear that the Stop TB distribution of I don't know if there was a needle exchange. I don't think that needles are widely prevalent in South African jails.
Yeah, we actually have quite a big problem with addiction treatment in our country in general, and certainly in prisons. I think there are only 2 clinics in the country that offer opioid replacement therapy, or at least 2 public clinics, which is the best proven treatment for opioid dependence. And certainly, as far as we know, those programs are not available in prisons. And in fact, many people in prison have quite reliable access to all sorts of drugs, which they get through officials and other ways of smuggling. That being said, even though the healthcare system in prisons is under huge strain, and in particular, there's a shortage of psychologists and psychiatrists when they are desperately needed, there are many ways in which it is a success, and one way that it's quite successful is in the distribution of ARVs. Whenever we visit a prison, we ask at the clinic, how many people here are on ARVs, and do you have regular testing, and do people take their medication? And generally, there's a higher proportion or higher prevalence than in the general public. But ARVs are provided every day to inmates reliably. And so with ARVs, with other forms of medication, in fact, sometimes officials and inmates tell us that they receive better health care inside prison than they do outside. And that's not because it's a perfect system, but because our healthcare system as a country is so compromised and under so much strain.
And just to make a small bridge, I gave you about just after that. That's a reduction of USID and PEPFAR. They said it's not for ARV. That's true. It could be around Truvada, this debate. But the problem is if you don't have any association, if you don't have any people that are trained to give medicines and to make reach out for the people, you will have a catastrophe. So this is why sometimes you heard that they don't cut PEPFAR programs. Yes, but for ARV, but all the prevention and all the people that made prevention, they were funded by US. It's a problem. Come.
It's quite hard, you know.
You can sit.
Thank you.
Sit on the accused.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sarah, and I wanted to find out from the both of you if, in your opinion, you think there's any legal instruments that can still be come up with in South Africa to help alleviate the crisis we have with GBV. And the reason that I'm asking is that there was a countrywide protest action on Thursday and Friday by Women for Change, and they were calling for the declaration of gender-based violence as a national disaster, to declare it as a disaster legislation that we had. So I wrote to them a few months ago, the first time they made that call, to find out what exactly are you seeking to achieve with actually having GBV classified as a disaster, because I'm very familiar with the disaster laws. Our disaster laws, for the longest time, are only used for climate-related, if I should say, crises, and recently health, when we saw with COVID. But I think in 2018, we did have a declaration under the disaster laws following the xenophobic attacks across the country. So then I wanted to find out from them, what do you then think this legal instrument that exists can then be used to assist with the crisis that we have with GBV? Because oftentimes when the Disaster Act is enacted, is so that there is, say, material, I don't know how to say it, but material, not benefit per se, but then the people that are affected by that particular thing get material whatever. So with COVID, we saw from, say, maybe monitoring where people go at certain times and whatever. With xenophobia, the xenophobic attacks, people had human settlements, temporary human settlements set up for them. So I just want to find out from yourselves, based on your experience, if there's any form of legal instrument that you think can either be come up with, or one that already exists, that could aid with the crisis that we have with GBV. Of course, we know that one of the reasons why we can, or one of the ways in which we can reduce GBV on the other side of the spectrum, is to just change how society relates to each other, as you said as well with crime, that half of our problems would literally go away if we reduce inequality, and to a certain extent, same goes for gender-based violence. But for me, the interest is more on wanting to use legal instruments, because I fear also the window dressing, if I should say, that gets done by a lot of mass movements. And I know it also comes from a place of frustration and being helpless, and not knowing what to do, and then you say, okay, let me just do something so that I'm seen to be doing something, but does it really help? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Sarah. I do have something to say, yeah.
I think that GBV is a difficult question. It's something we grapple with in the book, because it's an obvious question. You're criticizing tough on crime, tough on criminal laws. What do you say about the scourge of violence that women in South Africa experience? And it's tough for me and for my co-author Rebecca, we consider ourselves feminists. We understand that many of the women we know are vulnerable to violence. But we're also very critical of the criminal law as a way of addressing gendered violence. And so maybe I would say that I would be wary of legal instruments that are overly reliant on the criminal law and harsher approaches to gender-based violence. And there are many reasons for that. I think many women don't feel safe reporting to police, don't achieve results or experience the criminal justice process as incredibly alienating and dehumanizing. But also, we've seen in our work that often women are also victims of the criminal justice system, whether they are themselves incarcerated or whether the men in their lives are incarcerated. And so this is, I guess, a sort of confusing answer to a complicated question. And I think I would just say that I'd be very anxious and wary about calls for change that are overly reliant on carceral approaches, especially when, as we've said, the problem isn't the length or the severity of sentences, but that people who commit these kind of crimes are not actually successfully being investigated, prosecuted, convicted.
Yeah, Sarah, I'd underscore Sohela's point, which is that there is part of the answer does lie in consequences, but not in long sentences. But it lies in efficient response, efficient follow-up, efficient arrangement, efficient prosecution, efficient sentencing. And it's a controversial thing and quite a shocking thing to say, but if every single rapist in South Africa, every single rapist, it's a hypothesis which is difficult to postulate, got 5 years, you would stop rape. Because the certainty of a short period of incarceration would stop people from committing rape. It doesn't help to put 5% of rapists in prison for life. So carcerality to some extent, but the point I want to underscore, and from Sohela, as I understood what she's saying, is that it's a deeper social problem, and we can't deal with all our problems through carceral responses.
Thank you. Unfortunately, it's nearly time to close and to have a break with a glass of wine before the inauguration of the exhibition. But before that, I was in front of a very great poster of Association Aid. And Association Aid was founded by Daniel Defer and is directly related to Michel Foucault. So if you can say a few words about that.
Shall we do that now? Shall we do that now?
Oh, no.
No,
we can do for the opening of the exhibition.
Yeah, that's what I was going to do.
Okay. So, thanks to Cecilia, thanks to Alison, thanks to all the team of IFAS, thanks to Namata, your librarian. We have Discipline and Punish for Michel Foucault in English, and soon we will have Behind the Prison Wall. So, thank you, thanks a lot. It was, I think, a very interesting debate. A lot of questions, more questions, but we can speak about that with a glass of wine, and we have half an hour break before the opening of the exhibition. And thanks a lot. Oh.